Other ones are you get chairs that are unfair in their handling of debate. So they pre-choose who they want to speak, which skews the discussion. You know, the whole idea of democracy is that we come together and we meet and we exchange ideas, and then people, based on information, make a decision. And so if you get unfair handling of debate, then you might only get one or two perspectives of what's going on, and some critical information might be withheld just because the chair has a bias. Can't remember what was decided at the previous meeting. You know, that it's great when everyone, you know, when you have a happy, harmonious group. But you know, if you decided to spend $5,000 on something, and then, you know, 6 months later there's a disagreement about why you spent $7,000, then you should have the minutes to refer back to and on what was agreed upon. Meetings are too long and often off topic. Yes, so a parliamentary procedure provides tools for handling that sort of thing. Too much time spent with few results. Wrong people are running the meeting. Yes, these are all things that are covered in parliamentary procedure. I have a story to share about a meeting that was held here in Oregon. So Multnomah County is the biggest and most populous county in the state, and they splintered Monday night after 19 precinct committee persons tried to reelect Stephen Lloyd as chairman in the parking lot of a Gresham church. And the newspaper story that outlined this whole thing was a little bit sketchy, but you could just sort of feel the kinds of structural things that were missing and made up, and sort of violations of basic parliamentary procedure. It's unclear who led the. It was unclear who leads the county GOP because of the way the meeting was handled. The vote came in less than 2 weeks after the faction of the party voted to recall this person in a meeting guarded by a security team affiliated with the Proud Boys. One of them was one of the PCPs who voted on at the meeting. He said that he and other supporters of Lloyd showed up to the church. Vice Chairman Alan Connor and those who ousted Lloyd the previous week refused to let the party member Jane Hayes inside the building. Ball and 18 other members commenced to have the meeting in the church parking lot. And then after it started drizzling, they moved to the meeting to Bumper's Grill and Bar. All a very colorful meeting. A good parliamentary authority and a good set of rules protects members' rights. So you don't have these kinds of things where meetings are conducted spontaneously, and that everyone has a right to know about the meeting. So there's proper prior notice and all that kind of arrangements. WW stands for Willamette Week, which is our sort of alternative newspaper. So the meeting minutes provided to the Willamette Week showed that the Lloyd's faction at Bumpers voted to try and take over the Multnomah County Republican Party website and change the password so that the other faction no longer had access. Things like access to tools should be covered in your agreed upon rules. So the questions that occurred to me when I read the story was, what was the quorum required for the meeting to even make decisions, and was it achieved? How were the motions handled by the chair? Who called the meeting? So what were the rules for prior notice for the meeting, and was all of the members notified, or was it just some of the members notified? What was the agenda of the meeting? So was it agreed upon at the beginning how they were going to spend their time, or were people just showing up and then whoever was leading the meeting took it wherever they wanted it to go? And then were the minutes written in a way that was clearly documented the decisions that were made during the meeting? So organizations that operate happily with no disagreements often fail to see the need for rules, and especially organizations without assets have little to dispute. There was I was invited to go to a literary group that met, and they wanted me to sit in on their meeting and see if I had any comments. And so I asked them if they had bylaws, and they said, "Oh yeah, but we always move to suspend the bylaws at the beginning of the meeting." This group has no assets and they don't do anything except they get together and talk, which is great, but there's nothing to fight over. And so the fact that they did one of the a gross violation of parliamentary procedure, which is to suspend the bylaws, it didn't really make any difference because there was nothing to argue about. And really, what bylaws do is provide the way in which power is shared, and that's one of the key concepts of in a democracy, is that all the power starts belonging to the people, and then it's through the bylaws that the power of the people is allocated to the officers and to the committees and to the executive board in the interest of making the organization run more efficiently. And there shouldn't be any other reason for allocating power. Other power should be retained by the people wherever possible. But when you do have disputes, parliamentary procedure provides ways to resolve differences that are both that are democratic rather than autocratic. So if you don't have rules for meetings, I mean, we all arrive at meetings with lots of practices that some of us picked up from where we work and from going to other civic meetings and from, God help us, watching Congress debate, because they have their own special flavors of parliamentary procedures. And so if you don't have rules, you may have an agenda but no process for its creation or acceptance by the group. You may have minutes, but they may not be written in a way that captures the decisions. You may have impartiality, but nothing governs equal. In particular, there's no method for recourse. So if the chair is doing something that's improper and you don't have rules about how that can be corrected, then you pretty much have to live with the leadership that you got. If you don't have rules, there's no definition of powers given to the officers, committees, or the boards. And as I was saying earlier, the whole idea of democracy is that the power is allocated to the officers. If there is not a power that is allocated from the people, then it does not exist. So if someone in a position of power on the executive board tries to do something that is not given to them in the bylaws, then that's a violation of the bylaws. And it's actually not a valid decision, and it can be challenged. Some people, one of the problems with that a lot of people have with debate is that sometimes it gets contentious and it gets personal and it becomes stressful. And so they start looking for more harmonious ways to run things. And so there's groups that think consensus is a better way than majority vote, because you end up with a more harmonious group at the end. But General Roberts had some rules about consensus, and this goes back over 100 years. This isn't a concept that arose in the last couple of decades. Assemblies that tries to make such a requirement of consensus the norm, a variety of misguided feelings like reluctance to be seen as opposing the leadership, a notion that causes controversy will be frowned upon, fear of seeming to be an obstacle to unity can easily lead to decisions being taken without a pseudo-consensus, which in reality implies elements of default, which satisfies no one and for which no one really assumes responsibility. And I have seen this happen in a board that I belong to. That the chair would had a dominating personality, and he would, he thought he was striving for consensus, but he was basically a threatening personality, and so anyone who disagreed with him was, made uncomfortable. And so what he called consensus was really an autocratic way of doing things. And so people should really be free to vote their conscience. General Roberts went on to say, furthermore, what is apparently taken to be the sense of the meeting may well be little more than the least common denominator of such generality as to contribute little to the solution of the practical problem involved, thereby leaving such matters to officers or staff or the meeting's organizers to work out according to their own intentions. So, General Roberts was really a proponent of democracy in voting. And he said that, on the other hand, the evolution of majority vote in tandem with lucid and clarifying debate results in a decision representing the view of the deliberate majority for more clearly ferrets out and demonstrates the will of the assembly. And then if anyone, declines to debate or, they abstain from voting, that is their choice to do so. But it's, as I was saying earlier, the whole concept of democracy in a meeting is that we all get together and we hear each other out, and then we make the best decision possible. And I've always been amazed at how well group intelligence works, which is really what this decision-making process is. So the elements of parliamentary procedure, and there are a number of parliamentary procedures out there that you can adopt. Robert's Rules of Order is the one most commonly used in the United States. It serves around 95% of the organizations, but there are others. There's a simplified one called Bob's Rules, and what they are a reaction to the complexity of Robert's Rules of Order. And granted, it is a lengthy book. It's well over 700 pages long, and up until the last edition was issued last September, it was a bit difficult to read. I'm glad to say that the new edition, they have smoothed out the English, and it's much more readable, and their examples are much better for clarifying points. There are other ways to conduct meetings, but they tend to be, but through simplicity, they lose some of the nuance that you get with Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules has been developed over, it really started with the parliamentary procedures brought over from Britain into the colonies, and then each of the colonies sort of developed their own flavor of parliamentary procedure, and then that evolved into what Congress developed in the House and then the Senate. And then what General Roberts did was he took all of those sources and he synthesized them to come up with what he felt was the purest form of democracy, and then that evolved into Robert's Rules of Order. So you do find similarity amongst the other parliamentary procedures, but they are not as complete. So the things that you get that are specified as rules with a parliamentary authority like Roberts is you get an agenda and you have rules that provide basic protections for the membership. You have definitions of bylaws and standing rules and how they can be handled. You have a definition of a minimal organizational leadership necessary for an organization to exist. And that is, you've got to have a presiding officer, so someone directs the meeting, and you have to have a secretary who records the proceedings of the meeting, so you have a record of what transpired. You also get in the parliamentary authority or in your bylaws definitions of what a member is and what a quorum is, and the what the subject matter being discussed is. And also with the parliamentary authority, you get rules that prevent special meetings from lapping over into other topics, so that you don't have a special meeting where someone shows up, where they show up to make a decision on one topic and then it spills over into other topics for which people couldn't participate because they didn't know you were going to do that. The membership definition is really important. in one of the organizations I belong to, we have caucuses, and we don't have ways for memberships to be defined. So some unless they have a very interesting quorum definition, it's really hard for them to actually get anything done. And of course, if you don't have membership definition, what you find around elections is membership packing. So suddenly 50 people show up to the election and they vote for the leadership, and then they never show up again. If you have a definition of membership, then you don't get that sort of behavior where you get skewed voting. You get a definition of quorum and prior meeting notice, and if not to be too redundant over what I talked about last time, but the order of laws and rules are sitting on top of everything is state law and federal law, and then your organization has its charter and its bylaws, which define things that are unique to your organization. And then the beauty of having a parliamentary authority is that it provides all of these other basic rules that provide an underlying foundation for your organization, which you do not have to then repeat in the bylaws themselves. And so what you get in your parliamentary authority is a definition of a quorum. And you can, of course, define what a quorum is in your bylaws to be something that's more appropriate. And certainly if you have a membership that's into the 4 digits, you probably have to define it as something less than 50%, because if you don't achieve a quorum, then you cannot make decisions for the organization. A lot of organizations got caught during the pandemic because they had never approved electronic meeting rules, and you have to have electronic meeting rules in order to have electronic meetings, as opposed to meeting in person. And because they could never meet and achieve a quorum, they were kind of stuck in this quandary of how do they establish meeting rules so they can continue conducting their business. Some of them use state laws and state mandates that they could not meet as their justification for moving to electronic meeting rules. But the people who write Robert's Rules of Order really frown on that sort of thing, and they recommend that you retroactively go in and you approve rules that you had utilized during the pandemic that were passed in the absence of a quorum, just to make sure that everyone is in agreement with what you're doing going forward. Probably the most egregious violations of democracy I've seen has been in the last 2 years, where through the miracle of Zoom, anyone can be muted by the leadership. And I've seen horrible examples of where that was abused. That in the parliamentary authority, they do give you the right to make interrupting motions. So something like a point of order, or to call the meeting back to order so as following the agenda. These are interrupting motions, which if you are on forced mute, and if you raise your virtual hand but it's ignored, you cannot make those kinds of motions. And the bad part of it is that when you get that sort of overbearing behavior by the leadership, it could organizations open to not being democratically run and putting the decisions made in the meeting into question. There are rules governing the rights to attend and to speak and debate and make motions and vote, which are the 4 key rights of any member of an organization. And then, of course, the definitions of the key roles and responsibilities of the presiding officer and the secretary are also defined in the parliamentary authority, of which none is really decision-making. Really what the presiding officer is there for is to be an impartial leader for the organization to elicit the will of the majority. And it is improper for them to become partial and start imposing their will. That's why you see a good presiding officer, if they want to prompt something, they will say, the chair will entertain a motion to have a holiday party on, December 15th or whatever can move the assembly along, but the chair cannot make motions. The motions have to come from the membership because they're the ones that really hold the power. And of course, motions require a second and then a debate and then a vote by the membership. And then how decisions are recorded. I'm sure we've all seen bad minutes where too much information has been recorded inside the minutes. And so it's very difficult to read through minutes and find out what was really decided. And I've seen minutes where they completely miss the most important items that occurred in the meeting, which was the language of the motions. The motions that come from the floor are how business is, and those motions need to be accurately recorded because language matters. And whatever language the motion is proposed by the membership is what ends up getting debated and voted upon and becomes the agreed upon decision of the organization. That language has to be in the minutes, even if they're amended. The final version has to be there so you can refer back to them at a later date on what was actually decided. A quorum it provides a minimum number of members required to make decisions. There are a few decisions that can be made in the absence of a quorum, which is you can recess to go look for members to achieve a quorum, a meeting to reconvene at a later time when you have been able to make enough members show up to have a quorum, or you can just adjourn and then everything on the agenda flows into the next meeting is unfinished business. And what a quorum does, it avoids decisions made by a few on behalf of the group. And the organization should decide what the quorum is if it's not going to be 50, a majority, which is 50, just over half. Robert's Rules recommends that a quorum be the minimum number of people usually expected to show up at a meeting under normal circumstances. So if you have a snowstorm, you're probably going to get lower attendance and you might not achieve it, but you would base the quorum on what, in normal weather and normal circumstances, you would have show up at the meeting. A requirement for prior notice is really important. It allows members to know if unusually significant items will be considered at the next meeting, so they can decide whether or not they, use their tickets to Hamilton, or if they go to the meeting and have a fight on some topic that is very important to them, and they can prepare in advance for the meeting, and really know what is going to be discussed. And the minimum on prior notice is the location and the time of the meeting. If it's not passes a rule that everyone knows. So if it's always at Harry's Bar and Grill at 7 o'clock on the first Monday of the month, that becomes a rule. But it's always good to have a rule about giving prior notice so that people have reminders of meetings and they know when and where the meeting will occur. And they have to go to all of the members if you have a parliamentary authority, because if you start leaving members off because you don't like them, that you don't get to make that decision. Anyone who is a member is entitled to go to the meeting and participate. And again, if you do not, if you have made decisions where the decision, the result of the vote could have been changed by people who had not been notified, then the decision can be called into question and made invalid. The other important thing that has to be defined, that really should be defined in the bylaws, is how the bylaws are amended, and there should be rules around what gets published. a good organization will publish the language that is being proposed in advance at the prior meeting, so that everyone knows at the next meeting that the quorum is going to be modified, or that the meeting frequency is going to be changed, or whatever duties and the officers might be given in the bylaws. Those are published in advance, so everyone knows that that language is going to be considered at the subsequent meeting. It's not proper to show up at a meeting and just say, oh, well, we had unanimous consent. And again, the importance of having a defined membership is it prevents a takeover by outsiders. What we have built into our state law requirements on how much someone has to be a registered member of one of the parties in order to participate in the elections of it. And these are the kinds of safeguards that have been put in place to prevent takeovers by outsiders. But you should have a defined set of qualifications, so your credentials committee or whoever takes care of it knows exactly who is a member and who has a right to attend, and then who's not a member. And of course, having a defined membership allows for the calculation of a quorum if you've expressed it in terms of a percentage, not a recommended practice. So the recommended practice is that the quorum be a specified number, and which you can adjust in the bylaws later if you have a growth in membership and you want it to be greater. But it's always awkward when you say, well, 40% is going to be a quorum, and then you have this membership that varies from meeting to meeting, and so no one ever definitively knows what a quorum is. It always has to be calculated. And again, the importance of minutes is that they are the record of decisions. What decisions were made in meetings and what appointments were made, such as to committees and to boards. You think you remember who was appointed to certain committees, but it's always great to have minutes that record all of that in advance, or that records this as a result of meetings, so that if there's any question about what happened, you can refer to the minutes and get that corrected. Agendas are the way in which many of the issues about meetings are addressed, the people hate about meetings are addressed. And I view the agenda as like one of the first moves of a chess game. Number one, it allows the members to decide what will be discussed at the meeting. If the membership decides to spend the next hour and a half playing Parcheesi, it is their right to do so if they want to do that. But the proper way for agendas to come about is that your presiding officer, or who's ever designated in your bylaws, prepares the agenda. It is given to the assembly for approval, and then you have a majority agree upon how you're going to spend your time in that meeting. So, and then there are rules that where if there's deviation from what has been agreed upon, it is either voted on to deviate, or the meeting is called back to order, so that the meeting is adhered to. You can provide times on meetings, and you have to do this very judiciously because then they have to be adhered to. But if you have a meeting that starts at 7 o'clock and you want to have elections at 8 o'clock, regardless of what is going on, if that's what you have agreed upon in the agenda, whatever the current business is, then is set aside, and then at 8 o'clock you proceed with the elections as you agreed upon, and then when they're over, then you can go back to the order of business. And then what is especially nice to have is a adjournment time built into the agenda. So if your meeting starts at 7 o'clock and you have an adjournment at 9 o'clock, when you get to 9 o'clock, you can ask the assembly if they want to continue. Maybe there's some decisions that are still pending, and people are very interested in it and they want to continue debating, or they're exhausted and they want to postpone this and deal with this at a later time and they just want to go home. or maybe there's a snowstorm coming and people really need to get to their cars and go home. If you have a time, again, if you have a time at which the meeting is set to adjourn, then the chair can put that to the assembly, and then they can decide how they want to proceed. And these are the kinds of rules that come in place when you have a parliamentary authority. And in the absence of these things, you just have customs which can be argued. And it's kind of hard to imagine a world without rules because we are always surrounded by rules. But it's always nice to have one documented set of rules that everyone has agreed to abide by to resolve issues moving forward. And that is ultimately the beauty of having a parliamentary authority. And again, because all of the power starts with the people, and then they dole out the power, the parliamentary authority limits the powers given to officers, executive boards, and committees. And this goes to one of the questions that people ask was about the executive session. So boards cannot do, unless they've been given powers, they cannot do things that are in conflict with the membership. So the ultimate authority should be with the membership itself, however that is defined in the bylaws. And so if you have an executive board, they have the option to meet in executive session where things of confidential nature can be discussed and only shared amongst the members of the executive board. But what Robert's Rules states about executive boards is a society has no executive board, nor can its officers act as a board except as the bylaws may provide. And when so established, the board has only such power as is delegated to it by the bylaws or by a vote of the society's assembly referring individual matters to it. So the body can refer matters to a board, or they can give powers to the board through the bylaws, but there is no assumed powers that boards have that's inherent to their existence. And then there's the concept of the executive session. So a meeting enters into executive session when it is required by a rule or established custom or upon the adoption of a motion to do so. So if someone says, I move that we go into executive session, and then it just requires a majority vote to adopt. But the general rule is that anything that occurs in an executive session may not be divulged to non-members except any entitled to attend. And I believe the question was asked was, can executive boards meet in secret? Well, they can only meet in secret if they decide to do so. And ultimately, they are accountable to the membership. And so if the membership wants to change something or make it more explicit, they can pass the rules to do so by a majority vote. So again, if you wanted to study this material in greater depth, there are two books published by the Roberts Foundation. The one on the read, and it's a great overview and tour of parliamentary procedure for people who are unfamiliar with it or who'd like some clarity. If you need the full book, and certainly if you're like the chair of an organization or you're going to act as parliamentarian, if you have adopted Robert's Rules of Order as your parliamentary authority, then you should have the full book itself and then follow it. Again, all the power in a democratic organization belongs to the people. And in many organizations, the people have gotten into this habit of acting like they're watching a movie and that they're not really participants in what's going on, but the old saying that democracy requires constant vigilance. And so, you as a member if you have a parliamentary authority, you have the right to, call the meeting back to order if it strays from the topic. If you have set meeting times where things are supposed to happen and the chair is ignoring them, you also can make an interrupting motion that sets the meeting back to what has been agreed upon. And you also have the right to ask points of information. So if you need more information on which to make a decision, you can ask the chair about what you need. And then there's also the third one, which is a parliamentary inquiry. If you don't know how to do something, you shouldn't feel compelled to sit there in ignorance. You can say, would you please explain the process for appealing the ruling of the chair? Because even though there might be some ambiguity and the chair makes a ruling, ultimately the decision belongs to the majority, and that's a way in which the decisions can be moved to the majority if something that is so important that it's required to do so. So I hope that explains what the value of a parliamentary authority is. And I see that we have a bunch of questions, so why don't we go to answering them? Darlene, did you want to pose them to me? And then I'll do my best to answer them.
Okay, so we have some questions in the chat box, and we had also received a few questions in advance. So Larry, you touched upon the executive meeting. The question that we received said, can there be a closed executive meeting not open to the public if it is not written in the bylaws?
No.
Okay. That was very direct. And then we also
let me just elaborate that. And so you remember the quotes I made from Robert's Rules of Order. A board does not have any power that has not been given to it in the bylaws. And so again, there is no assumed powers that go with the existence of a board. They have to be given those powers. And again, they can go into executive session, like if they're going to talk about dismissing the executive director or anything of a confidential nature. That's okay, but they cannot just exclude people from attending.
Thank you. If someone is not present at the meeting, does the person need to abstain when the minutes are approved?
You have the right to do 4 things. You have the right to attend the meeting, you have the right to vote, you have the right to make motions, and you have the right to engage in debate. And unless there is a rule that's been agreed upon that abridges any of those rights, then you have them. And that includes voting on minutes at a meeting to which you did not attend. And Robert's, I just had a discussion with one of your members about this. Robert says, not the greatest idea, if you're voting on something about which you have no knowledge, but maybe you do have knowledge. And so there's no assumption that you are, you're completely ignorant about what was going on. And so ultimately you have the right to vote on whether or not to accept the minutes. You also have the right to amend the minutes. So if you heard that the minute that it was agreed upon that you were going to spend $5,000 on something and the minutes showed up saying $2,000, you can bring that up and move to modify the minutes, and then you have to rely upon the memory of all the other members in the meeting on what was actually decided if you're going to amend the record of the meeting. But yes, you do. It's not a great idea, but you do have the right to vote on minutes to a meeting which you did not attend.
Okay. Can a standing committee chairperson make a motion to accept their own standing committee report? For example, the treasurer moves the treasurer's report.
So the treasurer's report is unique in that it is a statement of fact, and if it is reported and it turns out to be incorrect, then you should just refer the matter back to the treasurer and tell them to come back to the next meeting with a corrected version of the report. Usually the way committees, the business is brought before the assembly is by motions, and motions can either come from the membership or they can come from committees. And in most organizations, work is done in committees. And so maybe you have the social committee, and they've been meeting, and they want to have 2 events. And so the chair of the events committee comes in and says, we need to build up our membership, and blah blah blah, and give all the reasons on why they want to have 2 events. And then they would move on behalf of the committee. I move that we have X number of events each year for generating membership. Because it's coming from a committee, and there's an assumption that the committee has more than 1 member, then you've met the requirement of having a second. So there's an implicit second in the motion coming from a committee, and then the item is before the membership to vote upon and debate or amend. So they can amend the motions coming from committees if they want to do so, or they can vote them down, or they can accept them. So I think that's what is meant by, can a chair make their motion to do things? And usually the sequence is, the committee chair gives a report, and then if they've come to conclusions, then they would make the motions that comes out of the committee for the membership to decide upon.
Thank you. And we do have some questions that were in the chat box. Do slates need to be published in local newspapers?
Well, there's no requirement in Robert's rules, and there's no mention of slates in Robert's Rules of Order, and that's the one I'm most familiar with. And I doubt if there's any references to slates in the other parliamentary authorities. I've seen 2 other ones that are predominantly used. Things like publishing slates would be rules that have been agreed upon by the membership, and they would either be placed in the bylaws. This is more of a nature of a procedure, and so that they would go into the standing rules. And not to get too much into the weeds, there's actually 3 degrees of rules inside of an organization. You've got the bylaws, which for the most part cannot be suspended, but they can be amended. And then you have special rules underneath that require a 2/3 vote for passage, because they have to do with curtailment of rights. The most common one is the duration and frequency by which people can speak. The default in the parliamentary authority is you can speak for up to 10 minutes twice on any topic. And this addresses one of the complaints of meetings, is that people start going back and forth, and then the discussion drags out and it gets redundant and people get bored. There is a limit upon which they can speak, and the chair might feel awkward telling someone, "Oh, you've already spoke twice on this topic, and you can't speak again unless someone moves to suspend the rules." But that's the rules. A typical special rule cuts down on the duration, so it's something like you can speak for up to 3 minutes for 3 times in a meeting, or something like that. But there is a limit. There's an inherent limit on how many times people can speak, and this helps control the redundancy. You also have, if you have a parliamentary authority, a motion called to call the question, which is one of the most abused motions in the book. But if the debate has become repetitious, someone can ask for recognition, and they can move to call the question, which means how does the assembly want to vote on this item? And implicit with that is ending the debate. And because you are impinging on people's rights to debate, this falls under the special rules, which has to be approved by 2/3 of the people at a meeting. They can also be suspended during a meeting, as opposed to rules are standing rules, which are mostly procedural. And these are great for like how elections are going to be conducted. It's always great for everyone to understand what the rules are, so you have a level playing field going into an election. And those are the kinds of things that usually bake into standing rules. Standing rules can be passed by a majority vote, and they can be proposed in a meeting without prior notice, and they can be suspended by a majority vote. And so they're a very handy tool for straightening out business with flexibility built into it.
Okay. How far in advance does the notice of a meeting need to be given?
That depends on the organization. I've seen a requirement of 60 days, which is really, really, really in advance. I mean, usually in the world that we live in, things change so fast that it's probably better to have a shorter one. 30 days is still a bit of a stretch. And if it's a regularly occurring meeting where people generally know when it's going to happen, then you could do it in a week in advance. Whatever it is, it needs to be spelled out in the bylaws and adhered to, so that everyone knows what their rights are to understand when a meeting is going to happen and where it's going to happen.
If a board needs to review an issue pertaining to a library staff member, can the board go into closed session excluding community members from that meeting?
Yes. And the minutes of the meeting also are confidential. They can be shared with other members of the board, maybe that were not in attendance, but yeah, that's executive session is to preserve the in confidence what is being discussed.
Okay, there was a question about how long minutes need to be kept. New Jersey has specific record retention schedules that may be different from other kinds of businesses, and Diane was kind enough to put the link in the chat box. General schedules, state, county, and municipal apply as well as the individual schedules for libraries. Is there?
Wow, I've never seen a retention law on minutes. So again, there's a hierarchy. If there's a state law on the retention of minutes, then that would take precedence over whatever you have in your bylaws. If there is no law requiring you to get rid of them, then you should never get rid of it because of the nature of motions. If you pass a motion and you have an organization that's 100 years old, if you passed a motion 100 years ago, that motion could still be in effect. And so your only record of it is that meeting in which the motion was passed. Sometimes rules are proposed and they're only noted as motions and they're not transferred over into a list of standing motions. And so your only preservation of the existence of those motions that created these standing rules are the minutes themselves. And so, one of the most prominent parliamentarians in the country who was one of the people who ran the final class I took to become a professional registered parliamentarian. He told us a story about where he went back through minutes that were 20 years old, trying to reestablish the chain of events that led to the current structure. And, there were clearly things that they could have done better that would have avoided that. And of course, it's really expensive to have a parliamentarian go back and dig through all of your minutes. But, because they were in existence, he was able to do that. So I wouldn't get rid of minutes ever.
And that actually ties into Diane's comment that state law retention on minutes is permanent.
Oh, good.
Do you have any model language for the definition of a member that should be included in the bylaws?
No, and that's really unique to your organization. We went through a process of defining recommendations for how the caucus's membership would be determined. And so we actually went through this exercise. The key thing is that you have some trigger that defines the point in time where they become a member, whether it's like agreeing to a belief statement. Usually, a great one is to pay dues or to ask for a waiver. I'm a member of an organization where that's what we have. You know, we don't want to make it a financial burden to anyone to belong to the organization, but there's got to be a way of saying you are a member and your membership ends at such and such a time if you do not either pay your membership or request a waiver for the subsequent year. That's the best. You know, if you don't need the money from memberships to be a viable organization, that's a nice way of doing it, so that you get participation of people who are interested, but you're not allowing people to be members who only show up like once a year for the elections or whatever. Now, the situation where you have in state law, the definition of who can make decisions within a party. I'm not familiar with what New Jersey has, but here in Oregon, the state law defines what a precinct committee person is, and they are elected positions, just like any elected position in the state. And so that is the definition of a precinct committee person, and they are a member of their county organization, and their membership does not end until their term of office ends. Or they are recalled from office. So if a precinct committee person who's been elected who is just completely inappropriate in the organization, if someone wants to remove them in Oregon, they have to actually go to the county elections office and initiate the recall process as if they were recalling like a county commissioner or something like that. And of course, because of the expense, that never happens. But you know, either hopefully it's got a duration defined, like a year or 2 years or 4 years, and it's got some trigger like to pay something or to ask for a waiver. And you might, you know, there could be qualifications on, you know, having certain amounts of knowledge. You know, maybe you have a model or whatever. It's really up to the organization what they feel is best to define the membership, but it's got to be clear and crisp so someone knows whether or not they're a member.
And we have another question pertaining to minutes. What are the consequences of not accepting the minutes?
That's a really good one. So I was in a situation where the board did something that was illegal, and so the minutes came up to be ratified, and what the decision was, they ratified the decision, they ratified the minutes because they were a record of the actions taken, but they did not ratify the actions themselves, because it was a meeting called that had not met the qualifications for a meeting, and so it had to be ratified at the subsequent correct meeting. What was the question again? To make sure I answered it.
What are the consequences of not accepting the minutes?
So you don't actually not accept the minutes. Either the minutes are accurate or the minutes are accurate or inaccurate. And if they're inaccurate, then they need to be corrected. They can postpone, you know, someone can postpone ratification of the minutes to the subsequent meeting. You know, maybe you showed up at the meeting and the minutes were not passed out in advance and they're 12 pages long and it looks like you've got like 60 seconds to review them. Well, that's of course impossible to do. And so if that is the kind of thing that happens and you have a majority on your side, you can say, I move that we postpone ratification of the minutes to the subsequent meeting. And then you've got the time in between the current meeting and the next meeting to review them for accuracy and make sure that they're reflective of what happened in the meeting itself. That you know, that's not a cool thing to do. Ultimately, they have to be ratified because they are the record of the meeting. So either they're ratified in the current meeting or they're ratified at the subsequent meeting, but they can also be amended. So if you find that the meeting minutes from 6 months ago incorrectly recorded a motion, you can move to amend prior minutes for them to be accurate. What you can't do is you can't change history. You can't say something that didn't happen and think you can, change history by modifying the minutes. That's not cool.
Okay. We had a few comments from part one. Could you talk a little bit about rules for small boards? A number of our libraries.
Oh, yes. So there's a chapter in rules for small boards and committees. So the way that sentence works is small boards, which they define as roughly 12 members or less, and committees. So it refers to all committees. And so the rules are abbreviated. And so one of the rules is that the chair of a committee or of a small board can participate in debate and can make motions. And there is no limit to debate. You can't call the question inside a committee or a small board, and you do not require a second for motions. And the one that gives me great heartburn is that you can have a vote on a motion that's not defined if everyone understands what the motion is. And I don't know how you get to that unless you write it down. So even though it says you can do that, I don't think it's a very good idea because it just leads to ambiguity. You should always have the motions in English or whatever language you're using, the language written out so people can look at the text and say, yes, this is what we agree upon, or this is what we disagree to. So those are the main differences between a formal meeting run by a chair who has to be impartial and adhere to rules of debate as opposed to a committee meeting or a small board where things can be done more informally. They also meeting, but this is not a good idea for a committee like the Rules and Bylaws Committee where you're actually dealing with language. And so in instances where you have a committee where you're dealing with things that reflect the language, it's a bit much to expect a chair to accurately record minutes and run the meeting. So in those cases, I would recommend either the committee elect a secretary permanently or pick one at each meeting so that the minutes are recorded properly.
Larry, I think we might have had a little audio in and out. At the very beginning, did you reference a publication or something for rules for small boards?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I live near a hospital, which I thought would deal with with connectivity issues because usually they get solid infrastructure, but I don't think that turns out to be the case where I live. And I have to have a little chat with them. So I apologize for any disruption in the meeting. There is a chapter in Robert's Rules of Order called Small Boards and Committees. And that talks about specifically modifications to the rules for administering a meeting that are more abbreviated and easy to manage and not as draconian as some people feel Roberts is sometimes.
Thank you. We also had a comment about public presence sector at meetings. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So you get meetings like county commissioner meetings where the public has the right to come in and observe their elected officials deliberating. And so in those settings, the members are the commissioners. So if you have 5 commissioners, they're the 5 members, and they run their meeting, and they're the only ones who have the right, the 4 rights of members to make motions, to speak and debate, and to attend. The public is allowed to observe, and what you usually find in public meetings like this is particular times where the public can give testimony. And so it's very clear when the mic is then turned over to the public, and then people can come up and say their piece. and then they go back and sit down. And then when that is finished, the chair closes the discussion part of the meeting, and then they resume their regular meeting. So usually, and, certainly if it's an elected office, those kinds of things are governed by state law. If you need, and certainly if you have a problem with an executive board making decisions that are inappropriate, you need to, I would highly recommend that you pass some rules that state exactly what they can and cannot do, so that they don't have a leash that's longer than what you want it to be.
Thank you. And we also had a follow-up question on the difference between sending an email to all for an information or a reply and its implications on the sunshine laws.
So the sunshine laws are defined by the state. The thing to remember about meetings is that, you remember these are all came out of the Enlightenment period. And, the whole concept of meeting is that people get together in one room and they have discussion and they come to a decision. And so Robert's rules generally governs the period between the calling the meeting to order and the adjournment of the meeting. And then anything that happens outside of that is not in a meeting. So, your right to speak freely and your right of association and all that comes into play outside of meetings. So anyone can, talk to anyone else, and they can say whatever they want, within the law. But the meeting rules are really for meetings only. And so we do get into a little bit of ambiguity when you start having people send around emails, but they don't count. They don't count as making decisions unless you have rules that allow you to vote by email. Like you can do that if you have rules, but if you don't have rules that allow that, then those are not legal votes. Because they are an infringement of your basic rights to debate. So, another area that is awkward is the chat window in meetings, where people start having a parallel meeting to what is going on. And so my recommendation is that unless you're going to use the chat window for making motions or other procedural matters, that the chat window just not be used, because you would never allow two people to have a loud discussion in the back of the room disturbing the rest of the members. The idea is that you have one person speaking at a time, and that people listen to that person and they understand what that person is saying, and then agree whether or not they're correct or not. But that you don't have the attention divided amongst several means of communication. Now, this doesn't mean that if you are in a meeting, an electronic meeting, you could have a group of people that are on Signal and they're having strategy discussions. That they can do that, and I've actually seen that done in meetings themselves. But you're not disturbing the meeting itself. You're still allowing a person to speak and be heard. And it's really the same as if you decided to leave the meeting and go stand out in the hallway to have a break. It's your choice to absent yourself from the meeting, and you have the right to do so.
Thank you. And could you talk a little bit more about the roles of the members on a board?
The roles on a board are defined in the bylaws, and they can make decisions with powers that have been allocated to them, but nothing beyond that. And if they do so, then their actions can be declared illegal and invalid. And their decisions can also be reversed by the assembly unless you have an agreed upon rule that says otherwise. again, everything that I'm saying, reverts back to your basic principles of democracy, but your organization may have given powers in excess of that to the president or to the executive board or to committees that may be improperly excessive. But if that's been the will of the majority, then that's what you've done. That's why it's so important to be very careful about the allocation of powers, and that you don't give powers away unless it's really for the efficiency of the organization.
And the closed or executive meeting seems to be a frequent discussion. Is there anything else that you would like to add regarding closed or executive meetings?
No, other than, sometimes you get leadership and you get boards who assume powers that they don't have. And those are classified as customs, and they're not enduring customs. So in the very beginning of Robert's Rules of Order, they talk about what you do with customs. If someone sees a custom that is in opposition to an existing rule, either in the bylaws or the parliamentary authority, they can make a point of order, and then that custom falls to the ground. So it could be that the chair always appoints members of committees when they should be elected. That could be a custom that's been going on, but someone can say, point of order, I believe that these are elected, and so we have to proceed with election, and that's what they have to do. So you should be able to find in the bylaws the specific powers that have been allocated to a board, which they cannot exceed.
Okay. Can the fiscal year be anything that the library decides, since some officers come into place throughout the year rather than a January to December? Like, for example, someone has new board officers that come on June 1st.
Yes, unless there's a state law that governs when the fiscal year is, organization can choose whatever it wants.
Do we have any other questions? You could either put them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself if it's easier to ask the question. So we'll give it one more minute in case anybody is typing. While that is happening, I would like to thank our presenter and parliamentarian, Larry Taylor, for another great webinar. We hope that our trustees, friends, library directors, library staff, and library supporters enjoyed the webinar. And everyone will receive a short evaluation to give us your feedback on today's program. Your input is very important to us as we plan future events. And our trustees will receive a certificate for 1.5 hours of continuing education in about a week. So I don't see any other questions. So I think, do I have a motion to adjourn? I think we're good. Thank you, everyone.